it's helpful to see normal operation. So on the factory key fob, hit the door lock twice to set the perimeter theft. Hit your remote start twice. Notice it'll respond once that it saw it, and then twice after the vehicle started, confirming normal operation. When you see these two quick flashes in a row like you see here, it means there's no response from the remote start unit. It's very helpful up front to know what they did with your data link connector before you get into diagnosis. So here's your factory DLC removed from its position, and it's plugged in, as you can see, to a sub jumper harness for this remote start. So that jumper harness comes with a new DLC connector that bolts up. That's what your scanner is being plugged into, and another side that plugs in to your module, which we'll show in a moment. But in essence, this unit is using the factory DLC to supply it with power, ground, and network in order to operate. With that in mind, make sure your scanner can communicate with all the other modules and there are no codes in those modules before you go into remote start diagnosis. Because if you can't communicate with anything with your scanner, this could be as simple as a fuse for the DLC being blown, and that will keep this particular factory remote start from operating. If you have good communication with all your other modules and no codes, then proceeding with this video will help you diagnose your remote start unit. You'll notice as you pull the dash down, or the lower part of the dash down, this module will be located up to the left of the brake pedal in most cases. You want to take a really good close look at the harness to make sure it didn't rub through or get damaged before you start diagnosis. So this would be the dealer installed remote start unit. That's the module that would communicate with, in this case, the body control module. And then this is our antenna cable. That's what picks up the fob. And this other connector back here, this cable is our power, ground, and communication for this factory remote. So I'll be showing you next how to check the power, ground, and communication going to that box, assuming that our antenna and the antenna cable are not damaged. So when you're going to diagnose the power, the ground, and the network, it'll be helpful again to know what they did. This is their version of the data link connector. The wires going to their version of the data link connector. The other side of this harness plugs into the factory data link connector. So it's using the factory data link connector's power, ground, and network. It's using pin 4's ground. It's using pin 16's power. And in the case of this would be Explorer, Escape, F-150 of these model years, it's using these medium CAN network pins in order to supply that to the remote start. So at the remote start connector, the little square connector that we just looked at, if you unplug this, I have it illustrated. If you tip it up in the direction I've got illustrated here, you should have power on this pin. Now that power pin is the red wire that feeds this connector. So that should have power when everything else is plugged in. The only thing you've got unplugged is the remote start unit. And you want to test that with a test light and a voltmeter. Same thing with the ground. That'll be this pin. That's our ground pin. We want to make sure that's a good ground, enough to light a headlight. And then we want to test our medium CAN. Okay. Now testing our medium CAN on this one, we should be seeing about 2.5 volts or so on each one of these pins. Okay. If you're not seeing 2.5 volts here, but you were able to communicate with everything in the data link connector, then you know you've got wiring problem in this sub harness. And that actually turned out to be what was wrong with this one, was a wiring problem in the sub-harness. Same thing, if you don't have power to this pin or ground to this pin, and yet when you were plugged into the data link connector, all your stuff communicated, then you know you have a sub-harness issue. And I will show you what this sub-harness looks like and what you can be looking for. Now, to be clear, if your power is good, or your power here is good, the ground is good, and your network voltage is good on both pins, you plug back into this module and you still get absolutely no response from this module. Meaning when you press the button, you very quickly get two flashes. If that's what you get, we're not responding. In that case, you likely have a failed module, and in most cases you're better off getting a brand new kit that would come with the sub-harness, the module, and the antenna. So again, one more illustration of the sub-harness. That's their version of the DLC connector. This is the connector that supplies power, ground, and network to the module. And this is where the sub-harness plugs into the factory DLC. So another issue you may run into is where the remote start is responding to the fob, but not correctly. After you've tried to start it, one beep would mean it received the command. But in some cases, it may beep back at you 3 times. I want to show you what that looks like. And what this indicates is that at least the module thinks that one of your doors is open. So there's my 3 flashes back. When that happens, that tells me that the remote start module at least thinks one of the doors is open or the hood is open, and that would prevent it from engaging remote start. So the testing for door ajar input is pretty simple. As you're seeing here, we're just going into the body control module. In this case, I'm using an Autel, going into live data, and I'm going to pull up all the door ajar inputs. And I'm not just looking for one that shows a jar or not a jar currently. I want to close everything, and I want to watch for any of them to be changing status. So if we have a door ajar switch that's just sticking, you might see it go rapidly open, close, open, close. And if that was to happen after you selected the lock button on your fob, if it happened brief enough, it could just interrupt the remote start. So I'm pulling up all of these, and note once I get them up and pulled up, you'll also note I'm looking at ignition key on status. Bottom line, I want to make sure it matches the key. And you can look at this data while the key is off. Okay? And while I'm monitoring it, I can verify all the door jars read like they should. I can verify by looking at the last transmitter button pressed, whether when I press lock and unlock, it's receiving all those. And when I have everything locked and I go to press the remote start button twice, I ought to see some kind of a response in that data. In this case, I saw nothing, and all of the door ajar status was correct at all times. And yet the module continued to report back 3 beeps like there was a door ajar. This one, it had intermittently worked on and off as the customer had hit bumps, and then it got to the point where it just stopped working altogether. And what was found in this one is when they installed the remote start, the part of the harness that had the splices, and this power circuit and splices are all next to each other, the part that had that splice was pinched, and you can kind of see how it's crammed right here, right up against a bracket underneath the dash, and it actually cut through and hit the power wire, and also pinched into several others where they were able to touch. So once that touch happened and got bad enough, it actually took out part of the module. But it's important to note that even though this part of the harness looked good, once I fixed this power wire and the other part of the communication circuit that I could see visibly damaged and touching, I still couldn't get it to actually respond to the transmitter. And that's when I went back and verified whether or not I had voltage to the module on these CAN wires that was shown earlier, and there was voltage on one but not the other. And when ohm tested, this color wire between the data link connector and the module, the remote start module, still roamed open circuit. When I opened up this particular sheath, these two wires weren't even touching anymore. Very poor job by whoever built this as far as how they put it together. But once that repair was done, that's what reestablished communication with the remote start module. However, from that point, the remote start module would never work correctly again. It wasn't capable of going into its programming mode, and it also would consistently report back that the doors were open. So in this case, this one got a new updated remote start, as this particular remote start wasn't available anymore. So a new updated remote start was put in,